Why the U.S. Air Force hides Soviet aircraft inside the USA. What if we told you that the U.S. Air Force secretly hid Soviet aircraft within their borders during the height of the Cold War? These planes were more advanced than anything the U.S. had at the time and were kept under strict guard. But why was the U.S. Air Force hiding Soviet aircraft? The answer may shock you. The truth is, No. For that, you have to come with us on the journey of today's video. So join us as we delve deep into the cloak and dagger world of Cold War espionage and reveal the shocking secrets behind one of the most audacious thefts in military history. You won't want to miss this. You're watching Military Worlds, and if you're enjoying what you're about to watch, then hit the red button to subscribe to our channel. U.S.-Soviet relations during the Cold War. During the Cold War, which began around 1945 and lasted until approximately 1991, the United States of America and the Soviet Union had a relationship that was both complicated and contentious. Because they never actually engaged in full-scale military action against one another, the two superpowers were in a condition of political and military tension that is known as a state of Cold Warfare. However, the competition between them was clear to see in the many proxy conflicts and arms races that took place as both sides strove to gain an advantage on the international scene. The Truman Doctrine was one of the important events that characterized the beginning of the Cold War. In this document, the United States reaffirmed its commitment to controlling the expansion of communism. This event was one of the major events that marked the beginning of the Cold War, and as a response to this, the Soviet Union made efforts to broaden the scope of its power and spread communism across the world. The two countries quickly became embroiled in a never-ending war for power, with each nation endeavoring to outperform the other in terms of their respective militaries, technological capabilities, and economic standing. Both the United States of America and the Soviet Union participated in an arms race, which led to the development and accumulation of nuclear weapons by both countries. This resulted in a state known as mutually assured destruction, in which the probability of both countries' annihilation in the event of a nuclear war between the two was extremely high. In addition, the two superpowers participated in a variety of proxy wars, in which they supported opposing sides in battles that were taking place in nations such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The conflict between the United States of America and the Soviet Union had a significant influence on international events and helped shape the political landscape of the world for decades. The rivalry between the two superpowers prompted the creation of innovative technology and contributed to the growth of scientific research, but it also produced widespread anxiety and instability. Despite the tension, there were efforts made to improve U.S.-Soviet ties, such as agreements to control weaponry and diplomatic talks. But, as we know, there can only be one king of the state, and that's the thing that both the US and the Soviet Union wanted to be. But, in this modern era, you are all the power. So, use this power to grow our channel. Please hit that bell icon and subscribe. Hiding the Soviet aircraft and reason. During the height of the Cold War, the United States Air Force was responsible for the massive and intricate operation of hiding Soviet aircraft. This operation was driven by a number of different variables and was carried out using a range of different tactics. The decision to conceal the aircraft was made for a variety of reasons, including the following: the desire to keep the existence of the aircraft a secret, the desire to protect valuable information regarding Soviet military technology, and the desire to ensure that the United States remained ahead in the arms race during the Cold War. The existence of the Soviet aircraft was concealed in one of the key ways, which was to conceal the fact that they existed. This was achieved by stationing the aircraft in inaccessible and secure areas, away from the general people, so that they could remain protected from potential threats. In addition, in order to stop the Soviets from finding out about the existence of the aircraft, the United States Air Force took precautions to hide them from spy satellites and other potential methods of discovery. Another motivation for hiding the Soviet aircraft was to protect sensitive information regarding the technical capabilities of the Soviet military. The United States was able to examine the technology behind the aircraft in secret, which allowed them to create new technologies and strategies to compete with those of the Soviet Union. This intelligence was utilized both to keep the U.S. in a position of superiority during the arms race that occurred during the Cold War and to get ready for any potential future military operations. But the question here is, why the U.S. wants Russian tech? How Russia was stronger than the US. Several factors contributed to the widespread perception of the Soviet Union as a formidable superpower during the time of the Cold War. The power of the Soviet Union's armed forces was undoubtedly one of its greatest advantages. The Soviet Union maintained a sizable army at all times, consisting of millions of people and employing cutting-edge military technologies. In addition, the Soviet Union was the first nation to create and test an atomic bomb, which provided it with a nuclear deterrent that assisted it in warding off prospective attacks from the United States of America and its allies. Further enhancing its military prowess was the Soviet Union's development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs for short. These missiles, launched from Soviet territory, are capable of reaching the United States. The Soviet Union's influence over Eastern Europe was another one of its many advantages over its rivals. Following the conclusion of World War II, the Soviet Union installed communist governments in a number of Eastern European nations, therefore establishing a sphere of influence and a buffer zone against future invasions from the West. Through a mixture of military force, economic help, and propaganda, the Soviet Union was able to maintain political and economic dominance over these countries. Because of this, the Soviet Union was able to extend its territory and enhance the amount of influence it had, which provided it with a substantial strategic advantage. Another significant benefit offered by the Soviet Union was its propaganda. The Soviet Union was very skilled in propagandizing its ideology and portraying itself as a defender of the interest of the working class through the use of propaganda. It was possible for the Soviet Union to acquire support from people in other countries who were sympathetic to communism and socialism because of the publicity operations that it undertook. This contributed to a growth in the Soviet Union's soft power and influence around the world, particularly in nations that were battling poverty, inequality, and political instability at the time. In conclusion, the people of the Soviet Union were highly homogeneous, sharing a culture and language that were widespread throughout the country. Because of this, the Soviet government did not have to deal with the same level of cultural or linguistic diversity as the United States government or the governments of other Western democracies. This made it simpler for the Soviet government to retain political unity and control. Even though it faced enormous challenges from the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union managed to maintain its status as a powerful and stable state, thanks in large part to the contributions made by this factor. It is essential to remember, however, that the United States enjoyed a number of benefits of its own throughout the time of the Cold War. The United States of America had the largest economy in the world at the time, and it had made tremendous technological and scientific advancements, which allowed it to keep a technological advantage over the Soviet Union. In addition, the U.S. participated in a number of military alliances, such as NATO, which assisted in providing a counterbalance to the military might of the Soviet Union. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Military Worlds.